Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar that will go into further detail on the content included in SLD fact sheet number 3. If I may, before we get started, I'm going to ask all of those that are on currently to please raise their hand to indicate that you can hear me and also indicate that you can, in fact, see the screen which shows the title slide. I'm seeing many are raising hands, so it looks like our audio and visual is set up. Great. So as I said, we'll be going over into more detail around this fact sheet, and as we move towards the July 1, 2020 date for full implementation of the SLD policy addendum, these fact sheets are designed to help support knowledge and understanding of particular areas of these policy changes. And they're also intended to support the transition to full implementation. This third fact sheet addresses the requirement for formal and/or informal diagnostic assessments in the evaluation of an SLD. To be clear, we are discussing the policy addendum for SLD, so this is what will be fully implemented in July 1, 2020, not our existing policy requirements, although I will be illustrating and drawing comparisons to similarities in our existing policy that already exist. Also, as such, because we are talking about the policy changes, the examples that we refer to will be within the context of suspicion of a disability. In other words, we are in an evaluation process and considering special education. Participant handouts, I believe you received a message, but participant handouts are located in the handouts file that's on your dashboard for the webinar. And they should include the slides for today's webinar, the SLD fact sheet number 3, and MTSS Comprehensive Assessment Guidelines document. I'll also note that today's webinar is being recorded and will be archived, so it will be available as a resource for school teams as they move forward in their planning for the SLD policy change. So today's presenters include myself, Lynn McCore. I'm the consultant for school psychology with the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction and the Carolina Institute for Developmental Disabilities. And also joining me today,
Lynn Loser. I'm the consultant for specific learning disabilities and ADHD here in the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction Exceptional Children Division.
Today, our objectives that you see, the goals that we are going to hope to accomplish in this hour of time we have together will be to begin with an understanding of diagnostic processes as they exist within a comprehensive assessment system and the comprehensive balanced assessment system as it exists within the larger framework of a multi-tiered system of support. We will then examine the 2020 SLD policy requirements and the purpose of diagnostic assessment. We'll be examining that through the lens of the continuation of the problem-solving process. We will be examining it through the evaluation purposes that we have when we're considering special education for a student who's in need of additional resources. And we will also be addressing the removal of the requirement for the psychological evaluation. At the end, our goals will be that we will also be doing some comparing and contrasting of formal and informal diagnostic assessments. So on this slide that you see here, it's just a quick snapshot of the content, some of the content that's in that SLD fact sheet number 3. The bulleted items that you see listed in the fact sheet is what we will provide further detail on today around psych evals, cognitive discrepancy formulas, and the use of multiple sources of data.
We're going to start by examining this table from the Multi-Tiered System of Support Comprehensive Assessment System guidelines. These guidelines are included in your webinar dashboard, as Lynn referenced, as well as linked on the resources page at the end of these slides. A comprehensive assessment system includes a variety of assessments that serve different and overlapping purposes. Assessments are designed for specific purposes and must be matched to the need. We're first going to examine universal screening assessments. Universal screening assessments gather and synthesize multiple sources of data to determine the effectiveness and health of core instruction. These assessments can be a critical source of information to establish evidence of appropriate instruction so that the majority of students are responding. In addition, universal screening assessments identify students at risk so we can quickly match students to appropriate intervention. Although this matching should be quick within a system where standard treatment protocols are established, diagnostic assessments may be needed at this point to confirm an appropriate match. However, in most instances where a standard treatment protocol has been identified to meet the common needs of students, diagnostic assessments will not be necessary at this stage. If it is determined that a student or students are not responding to the standard treatment or intervention, then the student support may need more customization or intensifying. When refining interventions at this point, diagnostic assessments and processes are an integral component. Diagnostic assessments help us determine why the gap in learning is occurring and to help us plan effective instruction and intervention. Diagnostic assessments help us answer the question, what will enable learning? Diagnostic assessments can occur at any tier of a layered system of support. Diagnostic assessments are not reserved for students who are at an intensive level of intervention or only at the point of a comprehensive evaluation for students suspected of a disability. When we're conducting a comprehensive evaluation, diagnostic information may be available as existing data to inform the evaluation, or we may need to gather additional information as part of the evaluation. We're going to take a moment to just review the criteria that's within the SLD policy. And most of you are probably familiar with this graphic representation of the 5 criterion. And you'll note at the very top, it says a convergence of data from multiple sources. And as you probably know, we've been really emphasizing the importance of this component of an evaluation that has always been required in policy. So the first criterion is the lack of appropriate instruction. This requirement, which applies to all evaluations, directs evaluation teams to document that the referred student has been provided with the instruction and interventions that are sufficient to allow for adequate progress. If the team can't document that the students' difficulties are not a result of the lack of appropriate instruction, that that's not the determinant factor for the student's difficulties, then the student cannot be identified as eligible for special education. The evaluation team must also document that repeated assessments, such as universal screening and progress monitoring, were conducted on a regular basis, and that the results of these assessments were shared meaningfully with parents. This requirement includes a number of important features of the infrastructure associated with a multi-tiered system of support. The second criterion, exclusionary factors, include loss of instructional time, which ensures that disciplinary removals, poor attendance, tardies, or high mobility rates are not the primary reason or the primary factor for the inadequate achievement. Criterion number 3 looks at inadequate achievement. This documents that the student's discrepancy or gap between current and grade or age level standards exists. The evaluation team gathers data from statewide testing, universal screening, progress monitoring, and other assessments that help drill down into student skills. These assessments have typically been gathered and reviewed by problem-solving teams during the course of instruction and intervention. If the evaluation team believes that this information is sufficient to address this criterion, then no further assessments would be needed. If not, the team can conduct further academic assessments. The purpose of this criterion is to collect evidence that indicates a significant achievement gap exists even after the implementation of targeted and/or intensive intervention and after the provision of learning experiences and instruction that's appropriate for the child's age or grade. The preponderance of data across data sources should indicate inadequate achievement in one of the 8 areas of a specific learning disability. Note that this gap and this criterion no longer includes consideration of the student's intellectual development. Criterion 4 looks at insufficient progress. This assessment of the student's progress in response to intervention is at the heart of responsiveness to intervention. During the comprehensive evaluation, the team analyzes all of the progress monitoring data, including the trajectory of the student's progress compared to that of typical students. The team might address questions such as, what evidence showed that the achievement gap between the student and grade level peers was closing? In order to benefit from the general education program, does the student need ongoing supports and services that could not be maintained or cannot be maintained through general education alone? And then criterion 5 addresses the requirement for adverse effect and the need for specially designed instruction. Whereas each of these criterion must be established, these criterion do not operate in isolation and are integrally linked. Diagnostic processes and measures may be used to support establishment of any of these criteria. The criterion for establishing evidence of a specific learning disability has had few changes. Although always required, there's an increased focus on the requirement of the use of multiple sources of data to both inform eligibility decisions as well as instructional planning. The current requirement for a psychological evaluation has been removed, and the requirements for an educational evaluation have been expanded with the multiple sources of data listed in I. which must include formal and/or informal diagnostic assessments. We will examine examples of formal and informal diagnostic assessments later. A definition of diagnostic assessments and processes was added to the SLD policy addendum and is listed on page 2. It's defined as diagnostic assessments and processes are used to assist in developing hypotheses about why a problem is occurring and to identify a student's specific skill deficits and strengths in order to determine the instructional focus and to inform decisions about how to adapt and individualize interventions. They allow instruction and interventions to be focused on the specific target skill and set of skills that will increase overall academic or behavioral competency. They assist educators in teaching precisely to realize the largest gains in student achievement. The definition again emphasizes the purpose of diagnostic assessments to answer questions to inform instruction and intervention.
And before we continue on and get to the end of the webinar, I wanted to add something I forgot to mention at the beginning, that please utilize the questions function on your webinar dashboard. If you have any questions that you would like a response to, because we won't be taking questions and responding to them during this hour, please feel free to utilize that that function on your dashboard. And we see that we have some comments in there that we've missed. So I hope that you can all hear us. I think I'll ask one more time to make sure everyone can hear us well. Please utilize the function on your dashboard to ask questions specific to the webinar topic as well. But thank you for those comments. We see that there are already a few that we'll need to respond to, and we will create a question and answer document that will be archived with this at the end of the webinar. If you can just pull up the attendees really quick. Can you all just raise your hand again to make sure that if you are hearing me clearly, raise your hand. Those that can hear me clearly, raise your hand on your dashboard function. I'm not seeing any hands raising.
Okay, so we're going to go back over to...
If you're having a problem hearing me, raise your hand. Not seeing anything. Okay, nobody's raising their hand. Go ahead. We're going to type into the chat box to see if to determine whether or not we're actually having technical difficulties. Okay, so we've just sent a message. Maybe you can ask somebody out there to log in to the webinar. Again, if you can hear me clearly, please use the function on your dashboard to indicate that you can hear. Right, right.
In the chat, though.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, we're not seeing anybody raising their hands.
We've got lots of questions. Hold on. I can hear you clearly. I've raised my hand. I raised my hand.
Okay.
And
Okay.
can hear you clearly. I can hear you. Okay.
Okay, so for some reason, we're not seeing your hands raising. Okay, sorry about that. We wanted to make sure the audio was still connected and we were operating. So yes, also use the questions function to submit questions regarding the topic. Okay, thank you. I'm not sure why we weren't seeing your hands. So anyway, getting back to the evaluation purpose, as you know, we kind of talked about, we're in this evaluation, we suspect a disability under IDEA for LD, and we really have to bring to the forefront not just one purpose that we often tend to focus on, but the other as well. And of course, whenever we're involved in an evaluation under the IDEA, we are determining whether or not one or more of the 14 eligibility classifications are something that we need to be considering. But we also are really searching for what is needed for this student in terms of instruction. And that is really the second purpose that we have to keep at the forefront of our mind. So we review existing information collected and additional information so that we could synthesize and summarize all of these relevant data into sound decisions around eligibility, of course, but not just eligibility, also educational planning, or how we need to move forward in the design of effective instructional match for the student. And that is regardless of whether or not the first purpose has been identified, meaning have they been identified as IDEA eligible? And if not, our intent and our purpose of instructional planning should not go away. So really, at the end of an evaluation, those things are really what we should be able to answer, or at least get closer to, with the student in question that we were investigating. Because keeping in mind, when students are referred for a special education evaluation, the reason should be that the resources provided through general education alone were not found to be sufficient in meeting the educational needs of that student. Our mindset moving into the evaluation is, if we haven't yet matched this student with sufficient instruction, then what do we need to gather in the search for effective instruction? Which underscores the point of this slide that we've used frequently to really bring back to the forefront that when we are entering into special education evaluations, this is the continuation and actually the intensifying of problem solving. Because when we think about the intent of special education to devise a program of instruction that will actually close those gaps and accelerate progress beyond what we were able to see within the context of the general education resources that were provided, then we must keep this problem-solving mindset at the forefront of all of our decision making. When we engage in an IDEA evaluation, the educational relevance, because we're school-based practitioners and we are in an educational setting, the educational relevance must be at the forefront of everything that we do. How will the information gathered through a multi-tiered system be used to inform the design and delivery of what we might end up with in terms of effective instruction? In addition to that, we think about some of these guiding questions that you see on this slide as we are determining what our evaluation plan for that student needs to look like. And also inform our investigation around what questions need to be answered in order to match that student with effective instruction that will help to close those gaps that exist. What skills does that student need? What have we done in terms of instruction and intervention that's found to be inadequate for this student? And how can we move forward to determine what might be of benefit? Is it intensifying what's been done, or is it making adjustments? We really have to keep a focus on what additional areas to investigate and make them meaningful when we are determining that second part of eligibility around effective instructional design. So to touch on the piece of the fact sheet that talks about the policy that has removed the requirement for a psychological evaluation. The requirement for the psychological evaluation has been removed, but in doing this, we don't remove the psychologist. The definition of the psychological evaluation is really just kind of summarized. If you look in our policies and the policy references there, we have definitions, and here is the kind of breakdown of what a psychological evaluation states is included and may also be included when we're entering into an evaluation. So the removal of the requirement for the psychological evaluation was based in the fact that it is an assessment of cognitive functioning. It must include an assessment of cognitive functioning. And in understanding what we need to know about identification of a specific learning disability, we understand that we do not need necessarily to have an intellectual score to compare to other areas of functioning and academic performance. So that is, why that removal came in. And as we walk through and talk about the diagnostic assessment piece, you're going to be able to see how some of these other components that may be included in cognitive assessment, as well as the other pieces that are actually part of our definition of a psychological evaluation that may include educational performance, social, emotional behavior, functioning, adaptive behavior. Those, the educational performance pieces, of course, would be gathered through the educational evaluation, but it is kind of just to give you a clearer picture of all of the components that fall under a psych eval. And in the definition, it talks about the formal and informal assessment measures, observations, interviews, and other techniques. And those pieces of what a psychologist might be involved with through their investigation using a psychological evaluation approach can be gathered through other means within the context of the evaluation. Those are important components that still apply to SLD. They're just not necessarily under the psych eval component now. And you'll see how some of those comparisons will be made as we go further on in our discussion today. So to make sure everyone's clear, the prohibiting of the cognitive piece is because we are moving away from cognitive discrepancy formulas being used for identification. That it will be prohibited, effective, and fully implemented July 1, 2020. So keep in mind the purposes of the evaluation as we're talking about this, and think about eligibility, that first purpose. The requirement of a cognitive discrepancy formula to apply to a determination around eligibility is now and will then be prohibited. So that first purpose of the evaluation is where the cognitive requirements removed. But the use of cognitive assessments or tools that might feed into cognitive assessment certainly are permitted if we are needing them to further investigate what needs to happen to effectively support instruction for the student. In some cases, the existing data may not provide sufficient information regarding what we may need to know. For instance, we may need to know more about whether problems with memory are a contributing factor. We may need to know more about whether attending to auditory or visual information is a struggle for that student. We may need to know the rate at which a student can process and apply new information might be a contributing factor. And these are some examples of how we might need to go into our cognitive assessment toolbox and pull some instruments that will give more of that diagnostic purpose to help inform effective instructional planning for that student. So as Lynn talked about earlier, she summarized, just to kind of reiterate and go back to that, the purpose of diagnostic processes. And we're really intentional, and you'll see why, about utilizing the terms and, using the term diagnostic processes when it's appropriate as compared to diagnostic assessment. And the processes that we use diagnostically, the purpose would be to assist in determining why a problem is occurring. It's not always going to be a specific test. And it could be informal types of processes that we utilize to inform our decisions around addressing problems that why students are struggling. It could be formal. And the processes that we use should always include multiple sources of data. And in many cases, within a healthy system, where a well-established multi-tiered system of support as a school improvement framework has been established, much of this might already exist as available data. So when we look at the multiple sources of data that we would want to apply within diagnostic processes, you can see that there may be things that exist as information that we've already reviewed on a child. So remember, we're in an evaluation. We suspect a disability, and we are, looking at all of the existing data that we have on a student. So in reviewing that would be part of what we look at. Have things been collected through student work samples, through their grades, previous tests, embedded assessments, in intervention programs that exist, if there's discipline issues. Those would be all part of the data that we review. There might also be diagnostic processes that have occurred or may need to occur within the context of interviewing. Teachers, relevant other school staff, the student themselves, would be pieces of data that feed into our investigation around the student and suspicion of a specific learning disability. There's also, and Lynn will touch on this a little bit later and kind of draw this illustration a bit more clear around observational methods that we can utilize to inform decisions that could be considered diagnostic processes. So it just kind of gives you this framework of review, interview, observe, test as a framework to apply across the multiple sources of data that we would collect. That is our existing policy requirement, as Lynn referenced earlier, where it's really been strengthened and underscored as we move into the SLD policy changes. But we are always required to utilize multiple sources of data to arrive at decisions around eligibility. And in the case of a diagnostic process and the use of diagnostic assessments may not always, the diagnostic processes may not always be specific tests we give. They may be done in other ways. So the other piece that's been strengthened, as Lynn referenced earlier, when she referenced the SLD policy addendum requirements, what you see here is the definition that we currently have around educational evaluation. So although it's definitely become clearer and solidified within the context of the SLD policy addendum, let's look at our existing policy requirements that fall under the definition of educational eval and think about how the existing requirements can be applied to our current work. When we can take our existing requirements and applied as they are currently written, it really positions us to be better prepared
to fully address the evaluation requirements within the policy addendum in 2020. So as you can see, and the policy references there, so you can, I just pulled out the big picture items. It's lengthier text and the definitions, but really an educational eval already requires, we must be evaluating something that is related to the current age or grade level, the curriculum that this child is in. So, all right, so we need to be evaluating, collecting educational information that is relevant. The educational evaluation is required to be comprehensive currently, using a full range of available instruments and observations. So again, going back to that RIOT framework, review, interview, observe, test, there are many ways that we collect information around educational performance that is not just administration of a test or tests. It already says in our current definition that the comprehensive nature of the educational eval includes diagnostic tests and other appropriate formal and informal measures. And of course, these evaluations must be conducted by licensed teacher or other appropriate professional who's been trained on the administration of the assessment. And of course, that would include, psychologists who are involved in the evaluation and other licensed professionals which is currently how we're utilizing and providing educational assessments of students. And we must be measuring their progress in learning and in skill acquisition. Just wanted to really help everyone kind of like go into our existing policy and really look at those pieces of those definitions that are related to the topics that we're talking about today, and begin really thinking about how we can take our existing policy and really ensure that we are applying it comprehensively the way that it has been written in order to be, fully prepared for the addendum changes to the SLD evaluations when they become required to be fully implemented in 3 years.
So as Lynn shared earlier, diagnostic assessments can be formal or informal. When we're selecting assessments, it's important to ensure that we match the assessment to the area of concern. So these are just some examples of some diagnostic assessments in the area of math. Some of these require specific qualifications, but most can be administered by educational diagnosticians, teachers, intervention specialists, and others that have the appropriate training and licensure. One informal way that we can gather diagnostic information is to use survey level assessments. These survey level assessments help us sample skills in an instructional sequence. This requires that we understand the trajectory of skill development to know what skills a student has acquired and where there are gaps so that we can begin instruction at the correct level for the student. So let's take a look at an example of a developmental progression around counting and cardinality and how we might sample skills in this progression to identify where a student has acquired those skills and where there might be some gaps in understanding. So at our first level, we would determine, does the student know number names and the counting sequence? Then can the student count with one-to-one correspondence to tell the number of objects? And this would include touching one counter each time they say a number, touching each item once and only once, recognizing when the number they end up with doesn't make sense, and being able to answer questions about how many without having to recount the sets of objects. And then the next step in this progression would be being able to count small sets of items, either in a straight line, in a circle, or in a scattered array. So that's just a small sampling of a developmental progression in the area of counting and cardinality, and certainly is not comprehensive of that progression, but just kind of gives you an idea of what we're talking about there. So here are some examples of diagnostic assessments in the area of literacy, both formal and informal. Just give you all a second to review those.
And these lists are not intended to be exhaustive lists.
Not at all.
Examples.
Just examples and a sampling of assessments. I'm sure there's many, many others that you all have and have used both formally and informally. And then we also have these other examples across all areas of, and Lynn's already mentioned this when she went through the review, interview, observe process of looking at student interviews, observations, both systematic and informal observations from both teachers, parents, and others who have observed the child. Those program embedded assessments, so if a student is receiving a standard protocol intervention, such as perhaps they're receiving intervention in foundations, there's assessments that are embedded within those programs that are an important source of diagnostic information to assess how the student is responding directly to the instruction that's being provided. We just went through what a survey level assessment looked like, where we can back map and find out what skills a student has acquired and where there are gaps. Of course, our curriculum-based measures, and then a review of student work samples, particularly writing samples and spelling samples, can be very informative. So just as a reminder, from Kowalewski, Vander Hayden, and Shapiro's book, that just reminds us that a school that has robust procedures for implementing a multi-tiered system of support has collected through that problem-solving process a wide range of assessment data that inform that delivery of appropriate instruction and intervention for that student through the general education system of support. But that information that's gathered through that process is important evidence for special education eligibility decisions. And this really underscores why, one of the primary reasons why we very intentionally integrated the implementation of the SLD policy within a multi-tiered system of support, and helps us understand why a multi-tiered system of support is critically important to implementing the policy in a way that allows us to make informed and appropriate decisions for students around eligibility and the design of appropriate instruction and intervention. So we're going to take a look at an example of a practical example of application of diagnostic processes within a multi-tiered system of support. So with this example, this graphic on the right side of your screen comes from the National Center for Intensive Intervention. And they call this model data-based individualization. So within this model, it's based on universal screening results, which allow us to place students in a standard treatment protocol in which the components are well specified. It's demonstrated to work for a large group of students, and it allows us to match that student to intervention in a timely and efficient way. Once that student is receiving that standard treatment protocol, we've assured that it's being delivered with fidelity and with integrity at the appropriate quantity of time and the quality of the intervention is there, then we're going to collect progress monitoring data to ensure that the student and students in that group are responding to the intervention and making adequate progress. When we have groups of students or individual students who are not responsive or are not responding at a sufficient rate to begin to close the gap, we may need to employ diagnostic assessments to determine how that intervention needs to be customized or adapted. So let's take a look at a 6th grade student, Alex. Alex has been receiving intervention, supplemental intervention in phonics, spelling, and reading fluency. His word recognition accuracy on grade level passages is at or above 95%. However, it's noted that he works really hard to decode unfamiliar words. He makes many self-corrections, and he has inconsistent prosody. Although he's accurate, his reading fluency rate has made minimal gains, and he's currently at 82 words correct per minute, which is well below grade level. His reading comprehension is inconsistent, yet it's noted that his listening comprehension and oral language skills are average. His teacher also notes that although Alex passes weekly spelling tests, and his parent has noted that they spend an extensive amount of time at home preparing for those tests, he doesn't generalize those skills to daily writing and makes frequent spelling errors. So what else might we need to know? What other information might we need to gather to answer questions to help us adapt and adjust and customize that intervention to increase Alex's response to the intervention that we're providing? So some of the areas that we might look at is we might want to look more deeply at Alex's decoding skills. We want to answer questions about what is his knowledge of sound symbol associations and his application of this knowledge to pseudo words. So we would want to administer a phonics survey to look at letter sound knowledge, phonetically regular words, as well as pseudo words. The team might determine that an assessment of spelling, a comprehensive assessment of spelling that looked at his knowledge of spelling rules and phonics and orthographic patterns of all 6 syllable types. So a spelling inventory that looked at his spelling of phonetically regular words of all 6 syllable types, as well as irregular words, might be helpful to the team. We would want to look at word recognition, his ability to recognize unfamiliar words out of context, both for accuracy and automaticity. So we might use a graded word recognition survey, looking at both timed reading of those words for fluency, as well as untimed for accuracy. And lastly, the team might consider reading and connected text to assess his word accuracy, automaticity, and prosody and comprehension of connected text. So here's where an informal reading inventory, such as a QRI, might be helpful. And also reading of unfamiliar passages from classroom texts. Here again, we might want to survey back from grade level to identify his comprehension levels at both independent and instructional levels.
So Lynn just went through the case of Alex as an example and identified within the context of an intervention system that exists within a multi-tiered system of support how diagnostic processes might be used to obtain additional information that will inform instructional planning for that student. The case of Alex may not always be as rich as far as information brought forward, may not always be as rich as we might need in our investigation to determine effective instruction. When you reflect on the case of Alex and have very targeted areas of concern identified and diagnostic processes in place to help support instructional planning in all of your data, that would be very rich data that's brought forward within the context of consideration of a special education evaluation. And this is where the quote that we use, and Lynn referred to again from Kovalevsky's book, is to really underscore how the data review brought forward is equally as important to everything we do in our investigation through the evaluation, and bringing those two pieces together, synthesizing them, and helping them to make sense to others to result in effective instructional planning for that student, as well as eligibility decisions for that student, is really hallmark in what we would consider a quality evaluation. So on the slide that you see before you there is, you know, in the case where we may not have as rich information as we may need in our existing data, but we suspect a disability and we are moving forward into a determination about, you know, special education. We would certainly review and have, as you know, information from a variety of sources that were documented and considered through the existing data review process in the referral. And at that point of data review, the team would then need to really identify what they have, what they know, and then what else they need to make sound decisions around eligibility in one or more of the 14 areas, and more importantly, the instructional planning piece. So in that data review, if we do not have rich data, we would determine that some additional diagnostic information is needed to answer our referral questions. So we would complete our evaluation plan, we would obtain parental consent, and then we would collect through our investigation evaluation what's needed to bring together with that existing data and make good decisions in terms of eligibility and instruction. So as we are kind of wrapping up our time together today, just some things to think about when we are moving into evaluations of any child, and whenever we are evaluating a child and considering special education, we must remember that this is a complex process. It is not intended to be a simple process. We are at a place where we have determined that the supports provided through the general ed resources have not been found to be sufficient for that student. So we need to move forward and know what we have and what we know about that child, and that ensures a comprehensive, clearly written and documented and carefully considered review of the existing data. And then from there, what do we need to better inform our decisions about special education eligibility and instructional planning for that student. So when we determine what needs to be collected, we are in essence designing a precisely written evaluation plan, which may include the collection of additional diagnostic information and also all those other things that we talk about when we talk about the educational evaluation planning of the student, for the student. And that you could see those last bullets I've kind of already interwoven into what I was talking about, that we need to be able to answer questions at the end of that cycle, at the end of the evaluation process. We should be able to clearly answer questions around whether an IDEA disability exists and the instruction that might be needed or is needed to support progress within the general ed curriculum for that student. And that is, again, regardless of whether we determine bullet 1. So even when we have students who are referred and we end up in a case where it is not an IDEA disability, we need to also conclude that process with some strong recommendations about instructional planning for that student that we just evaluated.
So these are just some additional resources that are available to you. The MTSS Comprehensive Assessment Guidelines, the MTSS Live Binder, and if you do not know, there is now an SLD eligibility tab in that MTSS Live Binder, which is your next resource that's listed there. That is the beginnings of our implementation guidance. We will be disseminating more. Then the SLD fact sheets are archived on the MTSS wiki on the SLD eligibility page, and we will put this webinar and archive that there also. And then I've added a link for the National Center on Intensive Intervention. We do have a number of questions that are in the questions panel. I greatly appreciate people putting those questions there. We're not able to respond to those in an hour-long webinar, but they're very helpful in helping Lynn and I determine what additional guidance we need to provide, either through webinars, through the SLD fact sheets, or to include in our implementation guidance and or to include in our guidance. So we'll certainly consider those questions, and we'll also consider if they're appropriate, just responding to in an FAQ that we can send out to you after this webinar to attach to the archived version in the wiki. Mm-hmm. So if you have any other questions that we haven't addressed, you might want to quickly check, enter those into that question box so that we can capture those.
And we thank you for taking your time today, probably during your lunch, to listen in to today's webinar. As we said earlier, continuing all the way up through July 1, 2020, we'll continue to develop fact sheets, and as the cohort trainings move forward, we will be digging deeper into the SLD identification piece within the MTSS cohort trainings. So we thank you for your kind attention today, and you will see this archived, closed captioned with possibly a companion question and answer document in the not so distant future. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.